Good evening and welcome all to tonight's webinar series brought to you by the Mount Sinai Hospital, Marie Josie and Henry R. Carava Center on 85th Street. I'm your host, Frank Vera. Tonight, as our guest presenter, we will have Rachel Kaplan presenting her topic of mental health, titled To Be Human is to Be Imperfect. Rachel is a licensed clinical social worker and psychotherapist who runs her own psychotherapy practice based in New York City. Rachel conducts individual weekly psychotherapy with adults and specializes in anxiety, chronic illness, relationship, family dynamics, and life transitions. She continues to see clients virtually and is licensed in serving clients in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. Prior to her work in private practice as a therapist, she worked at Mount Sinai Hospital for 6.5 years in various settings, including the cardiac intensive care unit and on the LVAD and heart transplant team, working with chronically ill patients and their families. Rachel is trained in cognitive behavioral therapy, psychodynamic approaches, mindfulness, palliative, and end-of-life care. Before we get started, I'd like to remind everyone that tonight is an open-ended discussion. We will have the ability to answer any questions that come in through our discussion text box. We also ask that you please take some time to fill out the survey at the end of tonight's webinar series for any feedback, comments, questions, or concerns. With that said, Rachel, the room is all yours.
Okay, thank you, Frank. Hi, everyone. So tonight we're going to be talking about perfectionism. And this title, To Be Human is to Be Imperfect, is just getting at the fact that perfection does not exist in human beings. These are some quotes I just really liked and I think really relate to some of the themes that I'm going to be talking about tonight. So I wanted to share them. The first one is from an unknown source that I really loved, which says perfectionism is the art of never being satisfied. Again, that concept that perfection does not exist, so seeking it out only leads to dissatisfaction and unhappiness. This other quote, perfectionism is self-abuse of the highest order. This was said by a psychologist and an author, and we'll talk more tonight about how being critical of yourself can really impact your mood and your happiness and your anxiety, and in some ways can really be self-abusive. So our agenda for tonight, we have about half an hour together, and I'm going to get you thinking about how perfectionist qualities relate to you. And you may not identify with the word perfectionism, and you may not see yourself as perfect or someone who really strives for perfection, but you are here at this webinar. And so you either maybe do identify as a perfectionist or are curious about perfectionism and how it shows up in your life. Maybe something in the blurb about the webinar, about some of the tendencies of perfectionism stuck out to you and sounded like it described you. Maybe you have someone in your life who's a perfectionist or has some perfectionist tendencies. So tonight we'll talk about perfectionism so that you can better understand how some of these qualities and characteristics of perfection might relate to you. Talk about how to gain some more awareness and insight into these parts of yourself, and learn some tools and techniques for how to challenge perfectionism and become more flexible in some of these tendencies. So this is my background, which Frank went over a little bit. I worked at Mount Sinai Hospital until recently for about 6.5 years. I worked in a group private practice doing psychotherapy for a few years, and then recently started my own private practice called Rachel Kaplan Therapy, where I see individuals weekly, adults for psychotherapy, and specialize in anxiety and chronic illness, life transitions, and relationship and family dynamics. Here's just my information if you wanted to contact me, and I'll have that on the end as well. So I'm going to start off with helping us to understand some of the impacts of perfectionism. Why is it even important to talk about this and recognize this in yourself? As I mentioned, as Frank mentioned, some of my specialties are anxiety, relationships, people dealing with transitions in their life. And while this may be what seems like the presenting issue when people are seeking support or coming to a therapist or will make someone reach out to me, I have found in my work with people, all different kinds of people dealing with different issues, that a lot of times they're struggling even more with a stressor in their life because they have perfectionist tendencies, because they are really hard on themselves. Perfectionism can cause a lot of anxiety and stress. It can really impact your mood. It can impact your relationship dynamics. It can impact your work. It can impact your self-image, the way you see yourself, your self-esteem, your internal dialogue, which I'll talk more about tonight. But what I mean by that is how you respond to yourself, how you treat yourself, how you talk to yourself. I mentioned this in the blurb as well about tonight. Learning to pay more attention to your self-talk and internal dialogue can help you be more supportive and patient and compassionate with yourself. Perfectionism can also impact the way you interact with others, or maybe your expectations of others. It can be just really exhausting and draining. And again, you might not be someone who identifies with the word perfection, and you may be someone who has outward success and has long-term relationships and a steady job and friends, or material success, or achieved some other successes in your life. But internally, maybe you often feel stuck or don't know how to change some of these patterns of how you see yourself, or how hard you push yourself, or what you expect of yourself. You may not identify those tendencies as perfectionism, and you may walk away from tonight feeling surprised that you have some perfectionist traits. Because I think the word perfection itself can be really off-putting. Maybe you can't see yourself as a perfectionist because you feel so imperfect. You may not be consciously aware that you are striving for perfection. So let's define perfectionism. What are some of the common traits of a perfectionist? And maybe you don't have all of them, maybe just some of these stick out to you. And I would argue to some extent, we all have some tendencies of perfectionism that show up for us, even if we're not a perfectionist, so to speak. So having really high expectations of yourself is very common in perfectionism. Being self-critical, maybe feeling inadequate or feeling like you're not good enough. For instance, are you someone who often thinks you could have done something better? You could have been better at something. Maybe it's hard to give yourself credit or acknowledge what you've done well, or acknowledge effort you've put into something when it's just about the achievement or the outcome, or what's measurable, the word success and productive. Maybe you only focus on what you think you could have done differently or better. Perfectionists tend to have people-pleasing tendencies. That's a main trait of something that comes up a lot with my clients, which can often be accompanied by fear of what other people think, fear of being judged by others. Maybe you're someone who in that way is really sensitive to criticism, or finds things really hurtful and takes things really personally from others. Maybe you try to avoid other people's judgment by trying to do things right or perfectly, or in a way that pleases others, so that you won't feel rejected or abandoned or not accepted. Maybe you're someone who often compares yourself to other people. Perfectionism often is rooted in comparing yourself to others and feeling lesser than, not feeling good enough, not feeling as good as another person. Or sometimes compares yourself to other versions of yourself, or an idealized version of yourself. So what I mean by that is maybe comparing yourself now in the present day to how you did something when you were younger, or what your energy level used to be like, or that you used to be able to work really long, crazy hours and push, and never feel the effects of that the way you do now. Or maybe comparing yourself to a version of yourself before you had a cardiac issue that brought you to cardiac rehab, before you had a kid, or before you were a caregiver. And when I say idealized version of yourself, what I mean is thinking about what you could be doing or how you could be handling things if you were better, if you were this perfect version of yourself. People who are perfectionists are often really rigid or controlling, or like things a certain way. Structure and organization and needing things to be just so is something that alleviates some of the anxiety that comes with not feeling in control, not feeling so perfect underneath that. Perfectionists tend to be really high achieving or overworking. And that is often based in feeling like your self-worth is based on achievement or success or what others think of you. Perfectionists often have difficulty relaxing or taking breaks, thinking about what else they could be doing or getting done on their list, or something they could be doing better that they need to go over and over again. Maybe the email you're writing, you're checking it multiple times before you're sending it to someone to make sure it sounds perfect and that person is going to perceive you in a certain way. Difficulty setting boundaries is a common trait of perfectionism. This can show up both with having difficulty setting boundaries with others or with yourself. Maybe you struggle to prioritize your needs or often make sacrifices for others, and feeling like you need to be accepted, to be seen as perfect, to be seen as someone who doesn't have needs or doesn't need their needs to be prioritized. There's often a fear of making mistakes, which can maybe hold you back from trying things or participating in something you're afraid of. Maybe you engage in some avoidance because you're really worried about making a mistake or doing something wrong, doing something not perfectly. Now, this next slide is a little controversial, but I think it's really important when we think about perfectionism is there are aspects of perfectionism that may serve you. And something I hear a lot from my clients after they've identified some of this perfectionism in themselves and better understand it, and they're able to acknowledge it and are more aware of some of these patterns showing up in their day-to-day life, is that they see some merit in some of these tendencies and they don't want to let go of them. There's some positive aspects almost of being a perfectionist. And then you may wonder, do I even want to or feel comfortable shifting some of this about myself? Your friends and family may think of you as someone who's really independent and organized and self-sufficient and always in control. And maybe you've worked really hard to portray that to the world and maybe believe that that is what makes you productive or helps you achieve things or what you need in order to feel motivated. Maybe it's hard for you to take a break or rest because you define productivity as being busy, as doing it all. And maybe even take some pride in some of these aspects of yourself. See yourself as motivated and ambitious. See the positive in this. But this isn't about changing who you are or totally giving up these aspects of yourself. It's about better understanding how being rigid in these tendencies can cause more distress for you. Are there patterns you can shift even just a little bit that may alleviate some of your anxiety or strengthen your relationship with yourself? Or help you give yourself more grace when you're having a hard time and something isn't going perfectly, something isn't going so well. This is about gaining more awareness of these patterns, having more insight into them, being able to notice them in the moment and sometimes shift them. So it's not so all or nothing, black or white, not letting go of these parts of yourself completely. But there can be a lot of fear of letting go or making changes. You might worry, how are you going to show up in relationships if you're not the one who's always being flexible and accommodating and bending over backwards? This is maybe what people expect of you or what people like about you or how people see you. And maybe you really want to be seen that way. And it feels really scary to shift that a bit, to be a little more flexible in the way you show up in relationship or the roles you tend to fill. Maybe worrying about how other people will view you if you don't always participate in things this way. I hear a lot of people worrying, how will I get things done? How will I function if I don't have this crazy to-do list and these high expectations of myself and push myself really hard? Am I going to be successful? Again, what does that word successful mean? Does it mean you have to be doing it all the time? Understanding and reframing all of this can be really impactful, knowing that control and high expectations of yourself and perfectionism are really coping strategies. And a lot of these behaviors or ways of thinking or ways of relating are in an effort to manage anxiety or another emotion. So thinking about perfectionism and these tendencies in this way can be a really powerful tool in itself. Understanding that these are coping strategies that maybe aren't working so well for you or aren't serving you or are causing some distress when you're really rigid in them and always participating in things in a way that is playing into these perfectionist tendencies. Being more aware of them can help you make just even small shifts and small changes. And I'm assuming you're here tonight or watching this video because you are curious about what making some changes can do for you. Maybe fearful of it, maybe uncomfortable with the thought of changing this, maybe feeling like this is just who I am and I can't change that and it serves me, or there are positive things about it. But there is some curiosity there. You wouldn't be here listening to me talk about this. Curiosity about how it may be really helpful and self-supportive to be a little more flexible in this way and understand yourself better in this way. So what can be really useful is understanding and thinking about what's driving this need for perfection, which I touched on a little bit, but what's underneath some of these behaviors or these ways of relating or these ways of interacting with yourself. Better understanding how these tendencies, these coping mechanisms have been serving you. Again, if we think about perfectionism and control and expecting too much of ourselves as coping strategies as a way of protecting ourselves from something, how are these coping strategies serving you? What are they protecting you from? What is the purpose of the controlling behavior? What's the underlying fear or emotion? Maybe asking yourself what's being avoided emotionally. There's really a feeling of safety when we think we're in control. And the controlling behavior or way of engaging in something or way of just operating in the world may temporarily diminish the anxiety or the feeling of inadequacy or the fear of what others will think of you, or maybe the self-doubt or the feelings of low self-worth. And in thinking about some of these questions and examining the root cause of the perfectionism, then you can address the actual fear or the emotion and respond to that instead. Sort of stopping it in its tracks when these are things that maybe you just automatically engage in. So with all this in mind and thinking about the why maybe you have some of these patterns, these habits, these behaviors, being more aware of them when they're coming up and checking in with yourself about what is underneath that, what's coming up for you emotionally. Let's think a little bit about how to deal with that. So with anything, with any change you're wanting to make, with any insight that you're trying to keep in mind and use then to shift behaviors, is slowing down and taking pauses and paying attention. So having awareness and into some of the perfectionist qualities you have will help you start to examine patterns and habits in order to change them. We cannot address or change what we don't first acknowledge. So that's really the first part is being aware of these patterns and noticing. So some of the things to be paying attention to is your internal dialogue, as I mentioned before. How do you talk to yourself? What does your self-talk and internal dialogue sound like? From the moment we wake up to the moment we go to sleep, we are speaking to ourselves, and we are usually our harshest critic. So really paying attention to how you talk to yourself. Are you self-critical? Naming the inner critic is a tool I've used with clients. It may sound a little silly, but I mean literally naming it. I have a client who named his inner critic Deborah. I don't know why that's the name he came up with, but what you're doing is sort of externalizing it a little bit and helping yourself understand we all have different parts of ourselves. And imagine if this inner critic, this Deborah, was a separate part of you or even a separate person, always looking over your shoulder, judging you, critiquing you, telling you you aren't good enough, telling you you could have done something better, telling you you need to do more, push yourself harder, comparing you to somebody else. Imagine how much that would impact your mood and your self-image and your self-esteem. That inner critic is often there. Maybe we're not listening to it or paying attention to it so explicitly, but that plays in so much into then how we're feeling, how we behave, and how we interact with ourselves and with everybody else. So literally naming the inner critic helps you kind of catch it and acknowledge it. Maybe tell it to be quiet or challenge it, or use that moment to then acknowledge a strength that you have, or how much effort you're putting into something, or what you're feeling, or maybe how burnt out you are that day. And that's why maybe you can't get to everything on your list, and giving yourself a little more grace as you pay attention to that inner critic and notice how often Deborah pops up and is talking to you and being really critical of you. You know, this also maybe sounds like something you'd say to a kid, but I think is really powerful with adults. We wouldn't accept someone else treating us like that. So why should we accept that treatment from ourselves? Again, slowing down and taking pauses and paying attention to and noticing how you talk to yourself. Thinking about your expectations of yourself versus maybe your expectations of others. If you're having a hard day or busy week, or kind of zooming out and thinking about how much is going on in your life, all your responsibilities or life transitions or stressors or health problems, do you expect yourself to just keep pushing through? Do you get frustrated with yourself when you struggle, or when you have a hard time, or when something takes too long, or you don't do something at your full capacity? You're not at your 100%. Are your expectations of yourself higher than they are for other people? Are your expectations realistic? Do you set impossibly high standards for yourself? If you examine your expectations of yourself, you may realize they're not realistic. You're sort of setting yourself up for failure, for feeling like you're not enough, for feeling like you're inadequate, for feeling like you're not as good as somebody else. And how do you respond to yourself when you don't get everything done or you make a mistake? And as you start to notice these patterns of how you relate to yourself more, asking yourself, would you expect this of somebody else? Would you treat someone else this way? Would you let someone else treat you this way and talk to you the way you're talking to yourself? Thinking about internal versus external validation can be really useful. So perfectionism is often about needing or relying on external validation, needing other people to reassure you or recognize you or acknowledge you. But how can you validate yourself? How can you be your own cheerleader and acknowledge your strengths, or when you've done something well, or when you've even just put in a lot of effort or tried really hard? Looking for acceptance from yourself, not just from others, being aware of that. Do you engage in reassurance seeking from other people because you don't really trust yourself, because you can't really reassure yourself? Noticing thinking patterns. If you're familiar with cognitive behavioral therapy at all, we call these cognitive distortions or unhelpful ways of thinking. And this is really common with perfectionism, the thought pattern of all or nothing or black or white thinking. It's a very rigid way of thinking. So maybe thinking either I'm a success or I'm a failure. I did something good or I did it bad. I'm the best, and if I'm not the best, I'm the worst. And that rigidity, sort of extreme all or nothing, black or white thinking, maybe feels a little safer and more comfortable. It's easier to understand. It's more acceptable in some ways. That gray area, that middle ground, can feel a little more unsettling. There's more room for nuance and for interpretation and self-doubt and uncertainty and ambiguity. And that can be more anxiety provoking. But when you notice that all or nothing thinking, that black or white thinking pattern, how might you reframe that for yourself? Maybe you weren't the best version of yourself today, or the best person at your workplace, or the best fill in the blank, or do a perfect job, but maybe that's okay. And maybe you can still support yourself and reframe that when you notice that coming up for you. That doesn't mean you're the worst. There's an example I heard in a podcast I was listening to recently about perfectionism, where they were talking about, just as an example, kind of all or nothing thinking. Either I go to the gym and I get an hour workout, or it's not worth exercising at all. And fine, maybe you can't get to the gym and do the hour workout that you had on your agenda for the week. That doesn't mean that walking for 20 minutes outside and getting a little bit of movement isn't helpful. The all or nothing thinking that comes up, maybe not exactly in that context, really takes away from any of the middle ground, the gray area. It doesn't have to be all. And if it's not all, it doesn't mean it's nothing. It doesn't mean if you can't get to the gym for the hour that you should just not exercise at all. Even if you walk around your apartment for 10 minutes or do some stretching, it can have a really good impact on your mood and your anxiety. And it's the same way with this all or nothing thinking pattern with perfectionism. Examining your values is a really powerful technique with perfectionism. What are you missing out on by focusing so much on trying to be perfect? If you spent less time worrying about what other people thought, or rereading and fixing what you wrote in your email over and over, or cleaning to keep everything perfectly tidy, or obsessing about work, or making a to-do list that is unrealistically long and spending way too long on each task, or not allowing yourself to take breaks or rest or do something pleasurable, or overthinking or replaying an interaction you had and worrying about what someone thinks about you. What are more fulfilling things you could spend your time on? What gives you pleasure and joy and makes you feel good? What kind of person do you want to be? What's important to you as a human being? Thinking about your values and your worth and your attributes instead of just focusing on achievements and accomplishments. Things like kindness and generosity and thoughtfulness and humor. Those aren't things we can measure as good or bad, perfect or imperfect, best or worst. Really thinking about your values. What do you value in your life? What matters to you? What do you care about? It's a really different question from what are my goals or what have I accomplished or what can I show from my day today? Do you value relationships and connection or creativity or personal growth or your health or your work and your education or leisure? Re-examining your values and what's important to you, thinking about what you're missing out on by focusing so much on what feels like it's not good enough or trying to make things perfect or engaging in some of these controlling behaviors and spending so much time worrying about them. Some cognitive behavioral therapy techniques can be really helpful with challenging some of these perfectionist tendencies, kind of poking holes a bit, some of the beliefs that are underneath some of these tendencies. Why does this matter so much? Why am I spending so much time and energy on this? Maybe even thinking about the worst case. What would happen if I spent a little bit less time on this? Or if I didn't do it all? Will everything fall apart? Will everyone in my life think less of me? Will I lose relationships if I'm not pleasing everyone all the time or putting others first all the time? What was important yesterday might no longer have any meaning for you today. Will this matter in the future? Will this matter tomorrow or next week or next month or next year? Setting more realistic expectations for yourself, really examining what do you expect of yourself? Is it realistic? Is it fair? Adopting more of a growth mindset can be really helpful. And what I mean by that is seeing mistakes as part of growing instead of as failures. So instead of avoiding mistakes, reframing them as part of learning and growing. I mentioned this earlier, but when you catch yourself being self-critical, acknowledging your strengths and your effort and your attributes and what kind of person you are, and placing more importance on that. Challenging yourself to do something imperfectly or leaving something undone. This one can be tough. This is sort of a form of exposure therapy in a way. And what it aims to do is help you tolerate the discomfort and the anxiety of not engaging in the controlling behavior, which there will be some discomfort and there will be some anxiety, but also challenging the belief that it's not okay and testing that. What's going to happen? What's going to change in your life? What's going to change in your relationships? This is really all about shifting your relationship with yourself, thinking more about how you treat yourself, giving yourself self-compassion, empathy, and acceptance, learning how to self-soothe. Again, if you're trying to get at what is the emotion that you're feeling, what is the fear driving the controlling behavior or the perfectionism, thinking about what else comforts you, what nurtures you, what makes you feel better when you're anxious or down or uncertain or fearful. And as you gain more insight and awareness into that emotion driving the perfectionist behavior, can you address what you're really feeling or fearing? Cultivating other ways to self-soothe and to address how you feel and what you need in that moment, instead of just engaging in a controlling behavior or perfectionist tendency. Using mindfulness to pay more attention to the present moment and refocus on what you need right now, on your values, and what you're grateful for. Acknowledging and responding to your needs, as I've been talking about. And now, with more insight into the why of some of these perfectionist qualities, just having that awareness and understanding of your emotions, what's underneath some of the controlling behaviors, and giving yourself permission to feel whatever you're feeling without judging it, without trying to control it, but simply acknowledging it and responding with self-compassion and patience and empathy. Again, we tend not to treat ourselves the way we treat others. So really trying to think about how you would respond to a friend or a loved one if they were going through a hard time or experiencing a certain emotion. What would you say? What would you do? Would you be loving and compassionate and supportive and accepting of them? Really trying to do for yourself what you do for someone else. I just went over a lot in a pretty short amount of time, but I hope that helped you to understand more about perfectionism and think about how this might show up for you, even in small ways, and help you notice and pay attention to these patterns so that you can challenge them and reframe them and just better support yourself. I'm just going to put my contact info here again. If you're interested in working together or know someone who would benefit from therapy, feel free to reach out.
Rachel, thank you so much for such an insightful presentation on perfectionism. I know that I could be very critical of my emotions, and you did bring up some very important truths about how we tend to not allow ourselves to feel certain emotions. And I think that can resonate with a lot of people. Um, but thank you so much for joining us and returning with us for some more insightful education and awareness on all the topics that you do. I want to remind everybody that Rachel, is practicing privately, and if you feel want to work with her again, her contact information is on the screen. Um, Again, thank you, Rachel. And I want to remind everybody that to stay tuned to their emails for the June newsletter and our webinars to come up for next month. I don't see any questions that have come in through our text box. So with that, I will just say good night to everyone and hope to see you soon. Thank you, Rachel.
All right. Good night. Thank you. Bye.